Hello. This brief video is meant to introduce the Count-by-Thirds Empirical Rule. This is a version of the empirical rule which is slightly different from the traditional empirical rule which shows up in many statistical textbooks. The traditional empirical rule says that if you move one standard deviation above and below the mean, that will capture about 68% of the data if your data is normally distributed. If you move out two standard deviations above and below the mean, that interval would capture about 95% of the data. And if you move out three standard deviations above and below the mean for a normally distributed data set, that should capture about 99.7% of the data. Unfortunately, those percentages aren't very useful, so we'll use the count-by-thirds rule instead. Instead of counting by whole standard deviations, the count-by-thirds rule counts by thirds of a standard deviation. In this case, if you move 2/3 of a standard deviation above the mean and below the mean, this will capture about 50% of the data. You can see here the shaded bars indicate about 50% of the data. Now we're going to continue the pattern by moving out an additional 1/3 of a standard deviation each time. If we move out another third of a standard deviation, that puts us to 3/3 or one whole standard deviation above and one standard deviation below the mean. And that captures about 70% of the data. You can see here the shaded bars are representing about 70% of the total data. If we go out another 1/3 of a standard deviation, that puts us at 4/3 of a standard deviation above the mean and 4/3 of a standard deviation below the mean. This will capture about 80% of the data. Going 5/3 of a standard deviation above the mean and 5/3 of a standard deviation below the mean captures about 90% of the data. 6/3 of a standard deviation or two whole standard deviations above and below the mean will capture about 95% of the data. And if we go an additional 1/3, which puts us at 7/3 of a standard deviation, 7/3 of a standard deviation above the mean and 7/3 of a standard deviation below the mean captures about 98% of the data. The next brief video that I prepare will demonstrate how to solve problems using the count-by-thirds empirical rule. Thanks for listening.